Charles Tyrwhitt sell an Oxford shoe for £169. Cream tissue paper. Old money packaging. But turn it over. Loake made that shoe. Same factory. They sell it themselves for a fraction of the price. 6 more brands are hiding in the same Northamptonshire factories. Let's find them. Find a way. There's a reason British men will spend an afternoon comparing 3 near-identical bottles of whiskey, reading the label twice, asking the man behind the counter about the peat content, and then walk into a shoe shop 20 minutes later and buy whatever the assistant hands them first, no questions asked. Shoes have always been treated differently. A suit, we understand, is negotiable. You can go cheap and get away with it if the cut is right and the cloth doesn't shine under office lighting. Shoes, we were taught, are the tell. The thing that gives you away in a room full of men who know better, the detail an old money father points to across a dinner table, without saying a word. So we overpay for them out of a kind of nervousness, a fear of being caught out in the one area of the wardrobe where fakery apparently can't hide, and the brands charging the most have understood that nervousness for a very long time. They've built entire marketing departments around it. Here's what they don't advertise. Northamptonshire has been the centre of English shoemaking for the better part of 500 years, and it isn't a large county. You could drive from one end of its shoemaking towns to the other in under an hour, past Kettering, Rushden, Wollaston, Desborough, Earls Barton, villages that still smell faintly of tanned leather on a still morning. There are perhaps a dozen serious factories left, and between them they make shoes for practically every English name you've heard of, and a great many you haven't. The same lasts carved to shapes that in some cases haven't changed in 80 years. The same Goodyear welting machines, a process barely altered since the 19th century, still stitching a strip of leather around the edge of a sole, exactly as it was done when your great-grandfather was a boy. Very often the same craftsman, moving between contracts on the factory floor, closing an upper for one label in the morning and another entirely by lunchtime, paid the same wage regardless of whose name ends up on the box. What separates a £600 pair of shoes from a £150 pair coming out of the same building is not always the leather, and it is very rarely the stitching. It's the brand sitting on the box, the shop it's sold in, the Mayfair rent behind the counter, and how much of your money is quietly earmarked for marketing and flagship real estate before the shoe has ever so much as touched your foot. Before we get into the 7, arm yourself with 4 things to check on. Any shoe, at any price, in any shop. First, turn it over and look for the welt. A visible stitched line running around the edge of the sole, just above where it meets the upper, means Goodyear welt construction, which means the shoe can be resoled, sometimes 3 or 4 times over a lifetime, rather than thrown away the moment the sole wears through. Second, ask where it was closed, not just where it was made. Closing is the stitching together of the upper, the genuinely skilled part of the process. And several English-sounding brands quietly send this stage to India or Portugal before finishing and boxing the shoe in England. That's not necessarily a crime, and it isn't always a mark of poor quality. It's simply information you deserve to have before you pay a premium for a story that isn't quite complete. Third, press your thumb into the toe box and along the tongue. Full leather lining feels warm, slightly yielding, almost alive under your finger. Synthetic lining feels cold and stiff, and slightly plasticky, however handsome the outside leather looks under shop lighting. Fourth, ask out loud about resoling. Any factory genuinely proud of its construction will offer to take the shoe back years later, strip the worn sole away from the welt, and rebuild it on the original last as though no time had passed at all. If a brand can't answer that question with a straight face, you're not buying a shoe. You're buying a disposable object with a leather upper and a very good story attached to it. 7 brands. Let's begin. Loake is not one brand. It's 3, wearing the same name, and understanding the difference is worth more to you than any single fact in this video. 3 brothers, John, Thomas and William, began making shoes at a small premises in Kettering in 1880, at a time when Northamptonshire was filling with small family workshops doing exactly the same thing. 5 generations later, the family still runs the Northamptonshire factory that produces the serious end of the range, a factory that still turns out around 4,000 pairs a week, using methods their great-grandfather would recognise. That's the 1880 line. Goodyear welted, European calf leather, cork slurry, filling in the insole, rather than the foam that cheaper makers use to bulk out a shoe and save a few pence per pair. Made, in full, in England. stamped as such on the sock liner beneath your foot. A pair from this line runs somewhere around £250 to £300. Not nothing by any measure, but roughly half of what the equivalent construction costs from the grander names on Jermyn Street, for a shoe that a shoemaker cutting it open would tell you is built to the same fundamental standard. Below that sits Loake Shoemakers, a mid-tier that mixes UK and overseas production but keeps the Goodyear welt, generally using a corrected grain leather with a shinier, more uniform finish rather than the full-grain calf of the 1880 line. And below that again, Loake design, made in India, cemented, glued rather than welted. Fine for what it is, at around £150, a perfectly serviceable shoe for a young man starting out. But it is not the same shoe at all, and Loake themselves would tell you as much if you asked directly. The trick, and it is a trick most men never learn in a lifetime of buying shoes, is knowing which Loake you're actually being sold, because the name on the box tells you almost nothing on its own. Here's what most men also don't know. Loake holds a royal warrant, granted in 2007. Proof, if you needed it, that affordable and cheap are not the same word. Whatever the men selling you something more expensive would prefer you to believe. And Loake has quietly made shoes for decades, under other people's names, private label work for retailers who would rather their customers assumed the shoe was made in-house. Which brings us back, rather neatly, to where we started this video. Barker has been making English shoes in Earl's Barton, Northamptonshire, since 1880, the same year, coincidentally, that Loake began 40 minutes down the road, as though the entire county had made a collective decision that year to start stitching leather for a living. Arthur Barker's original trick was a waterproof peg sole boot, wooden pegs that swelled in the wet and sealed the seam shut. A solution so effective that demand quickly outstripped what one man in a cottage could produce. He began employing craftsmen in surrounding villages, and the company that grew from that small beginning now produces around 200,000 pairs a year from a purpose-built factory on a 4.5-acre site, entirely Goodyear welted, using the same production philosophy that got Arthur Barker started in the first place. It has never quite managed to become fashionable, which, on this channel, we consider a point rather firmly in its favour. The retail range sits comfortably in the 200s, sometimes climbing toward £300 for the more elaborate brogue styles. But Barker runs a factory outlet directly from Earl's Barton, a short drive from the factory floor itself, and their online outlet regularly discounts last season's stock, sample runs and discontinued styles by up to 60%. A £280 Goodyear welted Oxford, built on a proper English last with a full leather sole, for closer to £110. Nobody at the wedding will know. The shoe won't tell them either. It'll simply outlast everyone else's there, and quietly get better looking while it does it. Cheaney has been making shoes in Desborough since 1886, when Joseph Cheaney established his own small boot and shoemaking business after years managing the factory floor for someone else. For decades, the company made shoes exclusively for other retailers under their own private labels, before eventually building its own name, and it was sold to churches in 1964, only for the church family themselves to buy Cheaney back in 2009 and return it to full, deliberate English manufacture. Uppers cut, closed and finished in the very same building where Joseph Cheaney set up shop nearly a century and a half ago, on a site that has hardly moved since. A new Cheaney runs into the 300s, which is a serious sum by anyone's reckoning, but the factory shop directly opposite the Desborough works, recently refurbished, though locals still fondly call it the Witch's Cottage, from its shabbier days, sells seconds and end-of-line stock at meaningfully reduced prices. These are shoes with a cosmetic flaw, invisible to anyone who isn't specifically looking for it. A faint variation in the grain, a slightly uneven dye lot, nothing that touches the construction underneath. Cheaney are also one of the few Northampton factories still producing Veltshire construction in their country brogues and boots. The leather turned outward over the welt rather than inward. For genuinely better weatherproofing, a detail most fashionable brands have abandoned because it's slower and more expensive to make. The stock at the factory shop rotates constantly, which is the only real downside. You take what's there in your size on the day, not what you'd carefully planned to buy online the night before. For a shoe built to be resoled for decades, that's a trade most men would happily make twice over. Sanders has been making shoes and boots in Rushden since 1873, founded by brothers William and Thomas Sanders, after William returned home from an apprenticeship in London, determined to build something of his own. The business has occupied the same factory on Spencer Road for over a century, and its name is barely known outside the trade, despite having supplied military and police boots to governments and forces across 5 continents, a heritage most of its more fashionable competitors would kill to be able to claim honestly. That heritage shows plainly in the construction. Heavier leathers than you'll find at the dressier end of Northampton, triple-stitched soles on the boot ranges, a general refusal to make anything delicate, built for men who intended to actually walk somewhere in them, rather than merely stand around a boardroom looking presentable. Sanders' shoes and boots run considerably below the Cheaney and Loake 1880 price point for construction that, in the country, and military styles particularly, is arguably tougher than either. It's the brand that turns up in specialist shoe forums, whispered about with real affection by men who've worn nothing else for the better part of a decade, and almost never in a glossy magazine spread. That, again, is rather the point of the whole exercise. If this video is saving you money on something you were about to overpay for, hit the like button now. Subscribe and tap the notification bell so you don't miss where we go next. And drop a comment. Tell us which quietly excellent British brand you've been loyal to for years. We'd genuinely like to know. This is the one that tends to stop a room, so pour yourself something and settle in for it. The MPS factory in Wollaston, Northamptonshire, has been making boots since 1881, when 5 local men banded together to form a shoemaking cooperative in an effort to bring some regularity to what had until then been unreliable piecemeal work. From the late 1960s until 2003, that same factory manufactured Dr. Martens under contract. Every single pair of the original 1460 boot that came out of an English factory during those 35 years came out of this one building, made by these workers, on these lasts, using this particular air-cushioned sole technology developed specifically for the job. When Dr. Martens moved production to Asia in 2003 to cut costs, the Wollaston factory didn't close its doors and give up. It kept the same machines, the same lasts, the same cutting tools, the same finishing processes, and simply carried on making the identical boot under a different name, Solovair, a portmanteau of Solovair. So the boot you grew up in, or your father did, scuffed and rehealed through several decades of use, is very possibly still being made, right now by many of the same hands, in the same village it always came from. It simply isn't wearing the same label anymore. A Solovair boot, built on those original lasts with genuine Goodyear welting, and the grey stitching and pull loop that mark it out to anyone who knows what they're looking at, typically undercuts a made-in-England Dr. Martens by a meaningful margin, and comfortably undercuts nothing at all, because there is no other English-made equivalent left at the price. This is not an homage, a tribute act, or a knockoff dressed up in nostalgia. It is quite literally the same boot, from the same factory, made the same way it always was, with the label changed and very little else. Save the cleverest for last, because this is the one that ties the whole video together. Herring has been selling English shoes from Devon since 1966, back when it simply retailed the big Northamptonshire names as they were: Churches, Barker, Cheaney, Loake, Trickers. Sold under their own established labels to a growing customer base who trusted Herring's judgment about quality. Then, as the family business passed to the next generation, they did something rather shrewd. They began commissioning their own designs, made to their own specification, by exactly those same factories they'd spent years building relationships with. A Herring shoe made by Cheaney is cut, closed and welted on Cheaney's own factory floor in Desborough by Cheaney's own craftsmen to full Goodyear welt construction with a complete leather lining and calf leather upper. It simply carries the Herring name stamped on the insole rather than the manufacturer's own. The saving is not trivial. Buying the Cheaney-made shoe under the Herring name rather than under the Cheaney name directly typically costs you noticeably less for a garment that, on the inside, in every respect that actually matters to how it wears and how long it lasts, is identical. Herring will tell you, if you simply ask their customer service team directly, exactly which Northamptonshire factory made any given pair: Barker, Cheaney, Loake, Trickers, Alfred Sargent. It varies style by style, and they're perfectly open about it once you ask. Most men never think to ask. The ones who do end up with a shoe collection considerably larger and considerably better made than their bank balance would otherwise have permitted. We began with a Charles Tyrwhitt Oxford at £169, made, very possibly, by Loake, in the same Kettering factory that sells the equivalent shoe under its own name for less money. 7 brands later, the pattern hasn't wavered once. Loake, Barker, Cheaney, Sanders, Solovair, Herring. These are not compromises on the real thing. In several cases, they are the real thing. Cut on the same lasts, welted on the same machines, by the same craftsmen who've been doing this work their whole working lives, in a corner of Northamptonshire that has been making English shoes since before anyone alive today was born. What you're paying for, once you get past a certain point, is rarely the leather. It's the shop it's sold in, the box it arrives in, and a name that photographs well in a magazine. The shoe underneath doesn't care about any of that. It only cares whether it was welted properly and whether someone, somewhere, will still be willing to resole it in 15 years' time. The men who've worked this out don't make a show of it. They simply have very good shoes, resoled twice already, and considerably more left over at the end of the month than the men standing next to them at the same wedding, in shoes that cost 3 times as much and will need replacing within the decade. If this has changed how you'll look at a shoebox next time you're standing in a shop, do us a favour and hit subscribe and tap that notification bell. We cover British craftsmanship, British value, and the kind of quiet old money knowledge that usually takes a lifetime to pick up and about 20 minutes to hand over. Leave a comment and tell us which British shoemaker you've been quietly loyal to for years. The one nobody else at the office seems to have heard of. We read every single one, and we suspect a fair few of you have been sitting on a proper secret. The next video's already on the shelf. We'll see you there.